I stood there, stunned, the laughter of my son's holiday gathering still ringing in my ears as my son's fist struck my arm. Still, I didn't move, my grip tightening on the cranberry sauce dish, feeling the cold glass. As my daughter-in-law yanked my hair, the sting of it sharp and raw, I heard the faint click of my phone unlocking. While they shouted, desperate to regain control, I dialed 911, my voice steady, a quiet certainty in the chaos. That's when I realized this would be the last time they got away with it. The sirens? They were for me. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Patricia Morgan pulled up the long driveway of Ethan's house, her old sedan crunching over the gravel. It was a quiet street in Des Moines, one of those where everyone knew everyone else's business, and the nights were cold enough to make the stars seem sharper. The house, with its split-level design and glowing porch light, looked like something out of a magazine. Clean, ordered, and the kind of place that made you feel at home before you even stepped inside. Her heart, though, felt nothing like that. Pat had spent the entire drive trying to calm herself, trying to remind herself that this was just a holiday dinner. Nothing to worry about, nothing that couldn't be smoothed over. She had brought the homemade cranberry sauce, the one she always made for Ethan, even though it was his wife, Chelsea, who hated it every year. Still, she thought, it was a nice gesture. It was just a small thing. The last time she'd tried, though, it had ended with a sharp remark from Chelsea about how she never got it right. That had been months ago, but it still hung in the air like a bad smell. Pat stepped out of the car, her knees a little stiff from the cold, and adjusted her woolen shawl over her shoulders. She took a deep breath and walked toward the front door, the crunch of her shoes muffled on the frost-bitten path. The door swung open before she could even ring the bell. "Mom," Ethan greeted her, his smile wide but tight, like it was something he had to force. "Ethan." Pat smiled back, steadying herself. She wasn't sure why she was always so nervous around him, but it seemed harder and harder to ignore. He stepped aside, and she made her way inside. The scent of roasted turkey and simmering vegetables hit her immediately. A few guests lingered near the kitchen island, chatting quietly. Everything looked festive. So normal. Too normal. Chelsea was the first to approach her, eyeing Pat's gift. "Is this all you got me?" Chelsea's voice had that sharp edge, a little too loud for the calmness of the room. Pat blinked, taken aback. "It's just a small token. I thought you'd like it. Some hand lotion and—" Chelsea cut her off with a dismissive wave. "Hand lotion? You don't even know what brand I use. You know, I can't use anything with lavender. It messes with my skin." Pat felt her throat tighten but kept her expression neutral. "I thought you'd like the scent. I'm sorry, I'll remember next time." Chelsea gave her a tight-lipped smile and turned away without another word. Pat's fingers gripped the edge of the dish she had brought, the cranberry sauce sitting like a reminder of how little she seemed to matter anymore. Ethan's voice broke through the low murmur of conversation. "So, how's the retirement life, Mom? Enjoying the peace and quiet?" "Quiet's good," Pat answered, keeping her tone steady. "But I've been keeping busy with the community center, you know, helping with the craft class." Ethan grunted in response, his brow furrowed. He cast a quick glance at the guests who were awkwardly shuffling around, unsure of what to say. Pat could see it. He was already annoyed, his patience fraying. The tension in the room wasn't exactly subtle, but no one spoke up. It was always like this. Those moments when the silence was just as loud as words, when you could feel things building and no one dared to diffuse it. "Can I ask what's for dinner?" Pat ventured, trying to ease into a neutral conversation. She wasn't trying to stir anything up, just trying to break the suffocating silence, but it only took that simple question to set Ethan off. "What? You can't see the food on the table?" His voice was too sharp, a snap in his tone that made Pat's stomach tighten. "Are you really that clueless, Mom?" Pat's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of shock flashing across her face. The guests went silent, looking at one another, but no one stepped in. "Let's just eat," Chelsea said, her voice too sweet, as though she were trying to overcompensate for the tension already thick in the air. But there was no escaping it. Ethan's anger was already boiling over. Before Pat could say anything else, he was there, his hand moving too quickly for her to react. The punch hit her upper arm like a heavy blow, sending a sharp pain through her. The sound of it, flesh hitting flesh, seemed to echo in the room, too loud, too raw. A stunned silence descended over the gathering. Guests froze, eyes wide, mouths hanging open. Chelsea immediately lunged forward, grabbing Pat by the hair, pulling her head back so violently that Pat felt her neck snap. She couldn't suppress the gasp that escaped her lips, but she didn't fight. She stood there, her back straight, even as pain shot through her scalp. The world outside of that moment seemed to blur away. No one moved. No one said anything. Pat took a deep breath, the air colder than before, but steadying her, making her focus. She didn't scream. She didn't retaliate. She simply stood there for a long, drawn-out moment, feeling Chelsea's fingers digging into her hair. Then, without a word, she straightened, and without a glance at anyone else in the room, she turned and walked toward the front door. The air outside was biting, sharp with winter, but it was clear. Clearer than anything inside the house. She didn't even flinch as she reached into her pocket for her phone. 911, what's your emergency? The voice on the other end was calm, impersonal. "I need help," Pat said, her voice steady, unwavering. "My son, my daughter-in-law, they've attacked me." The cold night air hit Patricia like a slap in the face as she stepped into the driveway. Her heart thudded in her chest, but her hands were steady as she pulled out her phone. The harsh light from the porch lamp cast long shadows across the frozen lawn, and for a moment, everything seemed impossibly quiet. The house behind her buzzed with tension, muffled voices, the sound of shuffling feet. But all she could hear was the steady, unshakable rhythm of her breath. Don't think. Just do. Her thumb hovered over the screen as she scrolled to 911, her fingers colder than she realized. She took another deep breath, inhaling the sharp bite of winter, and hit the call button. The phone rang once, twice, and then the dispatcher picked up. Her voice was calm, impersonal, like the voice of someone who heard these kinds of calls every day. 911, what's your emergency? "I need help," Pat said, her voice clear, each word carefully measured. "My son, my daughter-in-law, they've attacked me." There was a beat of silence on the other end, but Pat didn't flinch. She knew how it would go. Questions. Standard procedure. "Can you give me your name and address?" "Patricia Morgan," she said, the words sliding off her tongue like they were nothing more than an afterthought. "I'm at 1220 Fairview Drive. I'm outside." The dispatcher asked her to confirm the details again, asking for specifics about her injuries, her location, and her safety. Pat answered each question with a calm she didn't quite feel, but knew she had to show. Her son, Ethan, and his wife, Chelsea, hadn't expected this. She could hear Ethan's voice behind her now, loud and desperate, seething from inside the house. "Mom, don't you dare!" he shouted from just beyond the door, his voice harsh, strained. "Don't you dare do this!" But Pat didn't flinch, didn't even turn around. The gravel beneath her feet crunched as she shifted her weight. The only sound in the still night other than her own voice, as smooth and resolute as she could make it. "I'm standing outside, by the driveway. They're inside. I'm safe for now." The dispatcher's voice was calm. "Officers are on the way, Ms. Morgan. Please stay on the line with me." Pat stared ahead, her eyes locked on the porch light flickering just inside the door. The shadows of Ethan and Chelsea's movements danced in the windows, like ghosts, uncertain and jittery, pacing behind closed doors. The silence between the two of them felt like an eternity. She didn't know what would happen next, only that she had to be steady. Not for her, not even for the situation, but because she had made the call. And that, she realized, was enough. This time, she wouldn't let the shame or the years of silence take over. She would stand her ground. Inside, the guests were still hovering nervously. Pat could imagine them, too afraid to leave, too unsure to speak. The weight of the situation was as thick as the air inside the house. They were waiting for something, but no one knew what to do. It was so much easier to ignore things when they weren't happening to you. The minutes stretched on, longer than Pat cared to acknowledge. She heard the faint whir of sirens in the distance, growing louder by the second. They were coming fast. Ethan's shouting grew more frantic. "You can't do this, Mom! You're making a huge mistake!" She exhaled, her breath visible in the cold, and glanced up just as headlights crested over the hill. The police had arrived. The squad car rolled up to the curb with a smooth screech of tires, the officers stepping out quickly, their movements efficient and practiced. Two of them made their way toward her, while a third headed for the front door of the house. Ethan appeared in the doorway just as the first officer reached Pat, his eyes wide and burning with fury. "Get off my property!" Ethan yelled, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. His body was stiff, vibrating with rage, but there was something else too. A flicker of uncertainty, of fear, that Pat could almost taste in the air between them. One officer stepped forward, his voice low and firm. "Sir, step aside. We need to speak with your mother." The tension in the air thickened. It was impossible not to see the way Ethan's jaw clenched, his muscles taut as though he might lunge. The officer didn't flinch. "You need to calm down," the second officer said, voice calm but warning. "We're here to help." But Ethan wasn't having it. "This is my house. You have no right to be here." Pat remained silent, her posture straight, her feet planted in the cold gravel. She wasn't afraid of him anymore. The officers moved to separate him, one staying by Pat's side while the other went to the door. Chelsea appeared now, her expression as twisted as ever, eyes flashing as she stomped toward the officers. "Don't you dare arrest him! You don't know what's going on here." But the officers were already moving, guiding her away with firm hands. Pat could see the bruises on her own arm, the redness from where Ethan had struck her. But all she felt now was a strange emptiness. She had made the call. Ethan's voice cracked, desperation slipping through. "This is my family. You can't do this." His eyes caught hers for a moment. But she didn't blink. As the officers continued to take control of the situation, Pat took another deep breath, her steady gaze never leaving the house. This was only the beginning. Patricia stood in the freezing cold, still in shock but steady, as the officers escorted her toward the front yard. The weight of the moment was starting to settle, sinking in like the cold beneath her shoes. The flashing red and blue lights painted everything in harsh, frantic hues. But she didn't blink. She couldn't. Not now. She heard the muffled sounds of voices behind her as the officers pulled Ethan away from the doorway, his protests growing increasingly frantic. His feet shuffled against the gravel as he was guided toward the squad car. Chelsea, too, was escorted inside, her eyes darting nervously between the officers and the house as though the situation might somehow resolve itself if she just stared hard enough. Pat's eyes narrowed as she took in the scene. Ethan, her son, handcuffed and furious, paced in a circle like a wild animal, his movements jerky and aggressive. The small, quiet part of her that had hoped this moment wouldn't come, this final line of no return, felt itself shattering. Yet, she was still standing, still here. "Ma'am, we need you to step inside," one of the officers said, his tone respectful but firm. She nodded and walked toward the front door, where another officer, a young woman with kind eyes, stood ready to speak with her. She could feel the weight of the night, of everything leading up to this, pressing on her shoulders. Inside, the guests were still frozen, like rabbits caught in headlights. A few of them stood near the kitchen island, avoiding eye contact, while others huddled near the door, unsure of where to go or what to say. No one had moved since the scene outside. It was almost as if they were still in disbelief that everything had escalated this far. Pat stepped into the living room, the cool air from the open door cutting across her skin. She was aware of the bruises on her arm, the tightness in her scalp where Chelsea had yanked her hair, but her body didn't ache the way she thought it might. It was as if the shock of the assault had numbed her, leaving only a raw clarity. A clarity that had been brewing for a long time but had only now become tangible. The officer who had been outside entered the room after her, holding a notepad. He motioned for her to sit. "Ma'am, we need to get your statement. Please tell us exactly what happened." Pat sat, her fingers clutched tightly around her shawl, feeling the sharp edges of her thoughts take shape. She didn't look at Ethan, who was still pacing on the lawn, his silhouette visible through the front window. She wouldn't look at him. Not now. Not after what had happened. She spoke slowly, carefully, her voice unwavering. "We were at dinner. My son and daughter-in-law had invited me over for a holiday gathering. It was supposed to be a peaceful evening, but things escalated quickly. I tried to ask about the food, and that's when he—" She paused, taking a breath. "He punched me in the arm. Chelsea grabbed my hair and yanked me back. I couldn't do anything." The officer took notes, his expression neutral but focused. He didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. Her words were enough. After a long moment, he stood up and motioned for another officer to bring over the camera. "We'll need to document your injuries," he said gently. Pat nodded, her eyes closing briefly as the photographer snapped pictures of her arm and the small clumps of hair that had been torn loose. She didn't look at them, didn't study the bruises. There was no point. She had already seen them in her mind. She had already understood what they meant. Chelsea was no longer in the room, but Pat could hear her voice outside, still arguing with the officers, demanding answers, demanding control. She didn't sound like a woman fighting for the truth. She sounded like a woman desperately trying to hold on to the last shred of power she had over the situation. But Pat didn't flinch, didn't look away. As the officers finished documenting her injuries, Pat pulled out her phone. Her fingers shook slightly as she typed a quick message, the words simple, direct. "Wayne, I need you tonight." She pressed send before she could second-guess herself. Wayne, her neighbor, her old friend from the police department, would understand. He always understood. She could count on him now. When she looked up, one of the officers gave her a nod. "We'll be filing an official report tonight. You may want to consider a protective order, given the circumstances." Pat's heart quickened, but she kept her voice calm. "Yes, I'll do that." She stood up, suddenly feeling the weight of everything pressing against her chest, the years of silence, the years of enduring, all leading to this moment. She could hear the faint sound of Ethan's angry voice outside, still protesting, still furious, but she had already moved beyond him, beyond the house, beyond everything they'd tried to control. A small part of her wondered if this would ever feel real, if the life she had known would ever come back, or if everything would change from here on out. But she didn't have time for those thoughts. Pat turned to the officer. "I want to make sure he doesn't get away with this. He has to understand that there are consequences." The officer didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His silence was enough. Outside, the sounds of the police radio mixed with the hum of the city, the faint whispers of a life she would never go back to. It was over. And there was no going back. The drive to the ER felt like an eternity. The headlights of Wayne's car cut through the dark, but Pat didn't see the road. She couldn't. Her mind was elsewhere, still tethered to the house, to the moment she'd walked out onto the lawn, to the way her son had shouted at her, his anger shaking the very air around them. Every turn in the car felt like it was pulling her further away from the life she had once known. Wayne didn't say much. He was a man of few words, but there was a steady calm about him, a quiet reassurance in his presence. His grip on the steering wheel was firm, his posture relaxed, but Pat could tell by the occasional glances he shot her way that he wasn't fooled. He knew how much this had shattered her. "You did the right thing," he said softly, breaking the silence. Pat didn't reply immediately. She didn't know how to. How could she? She'd never imagined it would come to this. Never imagined her own son, the boy she'd raised, could do something like this. She'd spent the last hour in the sterile white light of the ER, letting the doctor document the bruises on her arm and the patches of hair that had been pulled out. The pain had set in only after the adrenaline had worn off, sharp, throbbing, and dull all at once. The doctor had been kind, but there was a certain professionalism in his eyes that told her he had seen this kind of thing before. Pat didn't want to be seen like this, but here she was, vulnerable, raw, exposed. And no matter how hard she tried to push the thought away, it kept returning. She had never been truly safe, not in her own home, not with her own family. Wayne's voice pulled her out of her thoughts. "They can't do this to you, Pat. You don't owe them anything." She looked at him, his profile outlined by the dashboard light. He wasn't looking at her now, keeping his focus on the road, but she could hear the conviction in his voice, like the words were meant for both of them. "You don't owe them anything," he repeated, as if he needed to remind her, as if the weight of those words would somehow help her understand the gravity of what was happening. Pat closed her eyes for a moment. I've spent so many years trying to keep things together. Not just for Ethan, but for all of us. And now it's all falling apart." Wayne didn't respond immediately. Instead, he pulled into her driveway, the car's headlights flashing across her quiet home. He parked and cut the engine, but neither of them moved for a moment. There was no hurry to face the mess waiting inside. Finally, Wayne turned to her. "What do you need, Pat?" Pat blinked, the question cutting through her fog of exhaustion. "I need to figure out what I've been blind to for all these years," she whispered. "I need to gather everything that ties Ethan to my life, my finances, my will. I need to make sure I'm not tied to him in any way that could hurt me." Wayne nodded, his face stern. "Good. You're doing the right thing. We'll get through this." Pat stepped out of the car, her legs stiff, and walked toward the front door. Inside, the house felt too quiet, too still, as if it was holding its breath, the same way she felt. She walked into the study, her old oak desk standing in the center of the room like a monument to the years of order and routine she had tried to maintain. She opened the drawer where she kept old documents, bank statements, tax returns, insurance papers. She pulled them out one by one, setting them in a neat pile on the desk. It wasn't just the financial papers. She needed everything. The will, the power of attorney, everything that tied her to Ethan. Her hand trembled as she sorted through the papers, each piece of paper a reminder of how little control she had in the end. When the pile was as complete as she could make it, Pat sat down. She picked up a pen, the weight of it unfamiliar in her hand, and began to write. It wasn't a long entry, but it was raw. She wrote what she remembered from the attack. Everything she could recall, everything that had happened so quickly. Her hand shook as the ink flowed onto the page, but she didn't stop. She had to write it down, had to make sure it was real. The weight of the pen felt heavier with each stroke, as if the very act of recording the event somehow anchored her to reality. Pat paused for a moment, reading the words she had just written. They were the words of a woman who had been silent for far too long, who had put up with too much. And now, at last, she was speaking. She picked up her phone and tapped out a message. Marla, I need to speak with you as soon as possible. This is no longer just about what happened tonight. It's about everything. She hit send and stared at the screen for a moment, the finality of it hitting her. There was no going back now. The sound of her phone vibrating on the desk startled her. It was Wayne, sending her a quick text. You're not alone. We'll get through this. Pat closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself a brief breath of relief. But just as quickly, the weight of everything settled back in. Tomorrow, she would begin the next part of this battle. And she would win. Because this time, she wasn't alone. She had already made the first step. Patricia sat in the small conference room, the hum of fluorescent lights overhead adding a sterile edge to the otherwise quiet space. She stared down at the papers spread out before her, her fingers resting lightly on the edges. Marla Jensen, the attorney she had called earlier that morning, was seated across from her, methodically flipping through police reports and photographs. Her calm demeanor was a stark contrast to the chaos Pat had left behind at her son's house. Marla had already reviewed the police reports, but each page seemed to carry more weight now that it was real. This was not some distant possibility. This was happening. There was no more pretending. Everything's in order, Marla said after a long moment, her voice low and measured. These photos are compelling. The officer's report, along with your statement, gives us a solid foundation. I know this isn't easy, Pat, but we'll make sure Ethan and Chelsea are held accountable. Pat nodded but didn't speak. The words felt foreign on her tongue. She hadn't realized until now just how much she'd been holding back. All these years, all the pain and frustration had been buried beneath a facade of normalcy. She'd kept quiet because for too long, she believed it was easier to endure than to fight. But that had changed the moment she walked out of Ethan's house. The moment she dialed 911, she had already begun to fight. Now, about the protective orders, Marla continued, flipping to another sheet of paper. We can file for an emergency protective order immediately. It will bar Ethan and Chelsea from contacting you, and they will be required to stay a set distance away. This is important for your safety, and it's the first step in making sure this doesn't escalate further. Pat's chest tightened at the thought of Ethan and Chelsea being formally restrained from her life, but she didn't flinch. It was a necessity now. She had to protect herself, her body, her mind, her future. Yes, Pat said, her voice firmer than she expected. I'll sign. Marla slid the paperwork toward her, a series of forms that would change everything. Pat picked up the pen, its weight suddenly overwhelming in her hand, and signed the first document. Each stroke felt like a final severing of a bond she'd tried for too long to preserve. Now, we'll also need to draw up a restraining order, Marla said, pushing another sheet forward. This one will be broader, keeping them away not just from you but from your property, your finances, any other assets that might be at risk. We'll need to make it clear that both Ethan and Chelsea have no access to your personal affairs, starting immediately. Pat's heart was pounding in her chest, but she didn't hesitate. I'll sign it, she said, her voice steady, though it trembled slightly with the weight of the decision. Her pen hovered over the page, the finality of it sinking in with each passing second. She signed again, and it was done. Marla nodded as she reviewed the document, ensuring everything was in place. Next, I suggest we take a look at your will, she said, sitting back in her chair. We need to make sure Ethan is no longer listed as a beneficiary, and we'll need to transfer everything to a protected trust. Pat felt the ground beneath her shift. I've already been thinking about that, she said softly, her hands trembling slightly as she reached into her bag for the legal folder she'd kept all these years. She pulled out the old, faded will, the one that had once been a symbol of the life she'd built with Ethan, the life she thought they would share. Her eyes flicked to the name she had once trusted so completely. Ethan Morgan. She didn't even pause before she crossed his name out, her hand steady as she rewrote it. Aiden, her grandson, would be the beneficiary now. Aiden deserves more than what they've left him, she murmured, feeling a rush of emotion flood her chest. Her hand lingered over the pen as she wrote Aiden's name in the space where Ethan's had once been. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a reclaiming of everything she had once given up. Marla gave her a thoughtful look as Pat signed the final document. "Good choice," she said. "He's been the one consistent source of comfort for you through all of this. He'll be safe, as long as you stay vigilant." Pat nodded, feeling the sting of those words. She'd made sure Aiden was protected, but in doing so, she'd made herself more vulnerable. She would never be truly safe until she kept up this fight, until she put the pieces of her life back together in a way that would protect her from those who sought to tear her down. "I'm ready," Pat said, her voice unwavering. "Let's file everything. I'm not backing down." Marla looked at her with approval, her lips curling into a small, tight smile. "It's done then. I'll file the emergency motions with the county clerk today. This is just the beginning, Pat, but you're doing the right thing. We'll move quickly." Pat stood, gathering the signed documents into a folder and holding them tightly in her hands. She wasn't sure if the weight was from the papers themselves or from the shift in her life that had just occurred. As she turned to leave, her eyes lingered on the papers one last time. The life she had known, the family she had fought for, was now nothing more than a series of signatures, each one marking a clean break from the past. There was no going back now. The door clicked shut behind her with a finality that resonated deep within her. The weight of everything she had just done, and everything that still lay ahead, pressed on her shoulders, but she didn't flinch. This was her fight now. And she was going to win. Patricia sat at her kitchen table, the sound of her finger pressing the block button on her phone echoing louder than she expected. It felt like the final confirmation that this was really happening, that her son, the person she had cared for and raised, was now someone she had to protect herself from. The screen blinked for a moment before the contact was gone, and Ethan's name no longer flashed on her caller ID. She let out a shaky breath, her thumb hovering over the screen as she scrolled through her call logs. She could still see the dozens of missed calls and messages. He hadn't stopped trying to reach her since that night. Pleading, threatening, sometimes demanding. She knew they were all the same. None of it mattered. She had made up her mind. There was no going back. No more excuses. Pat opened a notebook and wrote down each of Ethan's attempts, the dates, the times, the content of his messages, every detail. She was going to make sure that nothing could be twisted, nothing could be erased. She had to be thorough. Her pen scratched across the page, the ink feeling almost too heavy in her hands, but she didn't stop. Not now. Not when she could see the way Ethan's influence had seeped into every part of her life. Once she had the list, she carefully tucked the notebook into a drawer and picked up her phone again. She wasn't going to make the mistake of letting him worm his way back into her life, not after everything that had happened. She had to be stronger than that. As if on cue, the faint sound of a doorbell rang through the house. Pat stood up, feeling the tension crawl up her spine. She walked to the front door, peering through the peephole. It was Wayne. She opened it, and he stepped inside, his face grim but reassuring. "How are you doing?" he asked, his voice calm and steady. Pat smiled weakly. "Better, I guess. It's just hard to shake it all off, you know." Wayne nodded. He'd seen the signs of stress, the weight of the situation settling in, but he wasn't here for small talk. He had a job to do. "I've updated your security cameras," he said, walking past her to the living room. "I've added a couple more around the house. And I've set up motion detection. You'll get alerts if anything happens. You'll know if someone's at the door, or if there's any unusual activity. Pat followed him into the room, glancing at the small monitor he had placed on the coffee table. The house was quiet, and she'd never been one to feel paranoid. But after the assault, after everything that had happened, the idea of someone watching the house, someone with a constant eye on her safety, felt like a small comfort. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but sincere. Wayne gave her a knowing look, one that suggested he'd seen too many people in her position, too many people who hadn't taken these steps soon enough. "We're going to make sure you're safe. Don't worry." After a moment, he stood up and turned to leave. "I'll keep an eye on things. You let me know if you need anything else." Pat nodded. She wanted to say more, wanted to thank him again, but words felt too small in the face of all the support he'd given her. He'd always been there, a constant in her life, just as Aiden had been. And now, she had to focus on making sure the people she loved were safe, no matter the cost. When Wayne left, Pat went back to her desk. She sat down and stared at the pile of paperwork Marla had given her, the legal documents that would soon seal Ethan and Chelsea out of her life, for good. She reached for the phone once more, checking the time. It was late, but she knew she couldn't rest yet. There was too much to do. She opened her email inbox and saw an alert from her bank. Unauthorized transaction attempt. Her heart skipped a beat. She had forgotten that there were still some joint accounts tied to Ethan. Without hesitation, Pat called the bank and canceled the accounts, making sure that Ethan would have no way of accessing her finances again. She watched the confirmation screen appear, each click pushing her further away from the life she had once shared with him. A sense of relief washed over her, but there was still a hollow ache in her chest. The world she had known was disappearing, replaced by something much colder, more pragmatic. She could no longer afford the luxury of denial. The silence in her home was only broken when her phone buzzed again, this time with a social media notification. Pat frowned as she read Chelsea's post. "Pat fell last night. She's okay, but is just being dramatic about a minor accident. Please don't believe the rumors." Pat felt her stomach twist. Of course, Chelsea was trying to spin the story in her favor, trying to make it look like Pat was the one in the wrong. The lies were always easier to believe, weren't they? Without thinking, Pat grabbed her laptop and logged into her social media accounts, scrolling through Chelsea's post. She saw the comments flooding in, people offering sympathy, people questioning her credibility. Pat's heart thudded painfully as the weight of it sank in. But then she noticed something. Wayne had been active. He'd taken screenshots of the post, the comments, the timeline of events. He was already documenting everything, making sure Chelsea's lies wouldn't stand. Pat quickly responded with her own message. "It wasn't an accident. I was attacked. Don't let them tell you otherwise." Before she could second-guess herself, she hit post. The silence of the house felt more pronounced now, but it wasn't the silence of peace. It was the kind of silence that came before a storm. And Pat knew she was ready for it. She wasn't backing down. Not anymore. Outside, the wind howled, a reminder of the battle she was about to face. But inside, Pat sat at her desk, her hands steady as she typed. She was done waiting. The fight had already begun, and she wasn't about to lose. Patricia sat at the kitchen table, a mug of tea cooling in front of her. She hadn't bothered to drink it. Her eyes instead focused on the stack of documents, the same ones she had painstakingly organized the night before. The room was dim, the light from the street lamps outside casting long shadows across the walls. Silence hung heavy in the air, and though it had only been a few days since everything had changed, it felt as though a lifetime had passed. Her phone buzzed on the table, breaking the stillness. Pat picked it up, her thumb hovering over the screen. The name flashing on it wasn't one she had expected. Aiden. She hesitated, her fingers trembling slightly, but she tapped the message open. There, on the screen, was a simple, quiet text from her grandson. "Grams, are you okay? I miss you." Her heart ached. Aiden had always been her bright spot, the reason she'd held on to so much for so long. But now she knew things were different. He shouldn't have to be dragged into the mess that Ethan and Chelsea had caused. Pat quickly typed her response, keeping her tone gentle but firm. "I'm fine, Aiden. I'm just taking care of some things. But I'm okay. I'll always be here for you, no matter what." She stared at the screen for a moment, rereading her words. It wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. But it was the truth. She would always be here for him. And that was something Ethan and Chelsea couldn't take from her. As she set the phone down, her mind flashed back to Marla's warning earlier in the day. "No direct contact with Ethan or Chelsea, Pat. It's important. You need to protect yourself legally and emotionally right now. Anything they try to say or do will only undermine your position." Pat had nodded at the time, understanding, but now the weight of those words settled over her again. No contact. Not now. Not ever again. The hardest part wasn't the legal steps. Those were clear, logical. It was the distance, the silence. She grabbed the folder with her legal documents and flipped it open, taking a deep breath. She reached for a new sheet of paper and started the process of updating her beneficiary designations. Each stroke of the pen felt like it carried the weight of her entire past, but she didn't hesitate. She crossed out Ethan's name from everything. Trusts, wills, accounts. She put Aiden's name in its place, making sure it was all ironclad. Pat paused, looking at the list. Aiden deserved better than this. Than what Ethan and Chelsea had given him. He deserved a future without the weight of their toxicity. She wouldn't allow them to drag him into the destruction they had caused. He deserved safety and peace, even if it meant cutting the last tie she had left with her son. The phone buzzed again. This time, it was a notification from Marla's office, a quick email confirming their next meeting. Pat opened it, her eyes scanning the brief message. Marla had included a list of additional steps they would take: filing a formal protective order, putting a hold on the family property, and making sure Ethan and Chelsea were legally barred from any future control over her assets. Pat closed the email and glanced at the stack of papers in front of her. She was starting to understand how deep the implications of this would go, but as she sat there, she felt a flicker of something. Calm, steady. She wasn't just taking steps to protect herself anymore. She was reclaiming her life. A knock at the door startled her. She stood up quickly, her heart racing for a brief moment. But when she looked through the peephole, she saw Wayne standing there, his face soft with concern. She opened the door, and he stepped inside without a word, his presence reassuring as always. "I thought I'd check in," he said quietly, his voice low but steady. He walked over to the kitchen table where the paperwork was laid out and sat down across from her. "How's it going?" Pat nodded, her eyes flicking to the pile of documents. She hadn't told Wayne about the message from Aiden yet. It was something she wasn't ready to explain, not fully. But Wayne had been there for so long, and he could see the strain in her eyes. "I'm getting through it," Pat replied, her voice even. But there was an unspoken weight in her words. "Aiden, he reached out to me." Her voice faltered slightly. I don't know how to protect him from all of this. How do I keep him safe from them?" "From Ethan?" Wayne didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood up, walking over to the bookshelf. He pulled down a thick binder, one she'd put together years ago for safekeeping. "We'll get this all organized," he said. "You don't have to carry it all on your own, Pat. Not anymore. I'm here, and I'll help you make sure Aiden is safe, just like we'll make sure you are." Pat nodded, a lump in her throat, but she didn't speak. She knew what Wayne meant. He wasn't just talking about legalities and paperwork. He was talking about emotional support, the kind that only someone who had been with her through thick and thin could offer. The kind of support she hadn't realized she still needed. Wayne began pulling out more files from the binder, organizing them into a neat stack. The sight of everything coming together, grounded Pat in a way she hadn't expected. It wasn't just about the legal protections. It was about taking control back, piece by piece. "I'll finish this," Pat said finally, her voice steadier than before. She looked at the folder of documents, at the work that still lay ahead. "But I'll need your help, Wayne, to keep it all straight, to make sure Aiden is safe." Wayne smiled softly. "Of course. We'll make sure of it." Pat sat down again, the quiet of the room enveloping her. Her fingers brushed over the stack of papers, and she felt a sense of finality settle in her chest. This was the last step, the last decision, the last piece of her old life that she needed to let go of. But even in the silence, the weight of the future was already pulling her forward, and she wasn't afraid anymore. The morning sun was barely breaking through the clouds when the officers arrived at Ethan and Chelsea's home. Pat stood on the porch of her own house, watching from behind the privacy of the curtains. She knew what was coming, had known for days now, but there was something almost surreal about seeing it unfold. Her phone buzzed. A text from Wayne. "It's happening. Stay steady. They won't know what hit them." She replied with a simple, "I'm ready." Pat wasn't sure if she meant it as much as she wanted to, but the words felt true. This was it. There would be no going back. The officers approached Ethan and Chelsea's front door with the firm, methodical precision Pat had seen countless times before. They were professionals, moving with purpose, understanding the delicate balance between law and emotion. Ethan, standing at the front door with his arms crossed, glared at them as though daring them to approach. His defiance was palpable, his face a portrait of frustration and fury. Pat watched through the window as one of the officers stepped forward, a document in hand. He spoke calmly but firmly, announcing that they were serving protective orders. Ethan's face twisted into a scowl, his voice rising in protest. "This is my house," he shouted, his voice sharp, crackling with anger. "You can't do this. You have no right." Chelsea appeared at the door just behind him, her hands on her hips, glaring at the officers with an intensity that sent a chill down Pat's spine. She had never been one to back down from a confrontation, and today was no different. "Don't you dare!" Chelsea shrieked, her voice high-pitched, breaking into a frantic shout. "You have no idea what she's done. She's lying. This is all a setup." Pat winced at the sound of Chelsea's voice, the panic and anger in it cutting through the quiet of the morning. She could feel every nerve in her body telling her to go outside, to intervene, but she stayed still. Marla's voice echoed in her mind. "Don't engage. They will try to pull you back in." The officers moved with practiced efficiency, unfazed by the tantrum unfolding before them. One officer handed Ethan the papers, explaining the terms of the protective orders. Chelsea's eyes narrowed as she grabbed the document, scanning it with disbelief. The second officer addressed her, calmly repeating the same terms. Pat's heart tightened as she watched, knowing how they must be feeling, cornered, helpless, as if the walls were closing in. Then it happened. Chelsea's scream pierced the air, a raw, frantic sound that echoed across the neighborhood. "This is bullshit," she yelled, her face contorted with rage. "You're taking his side? You can't do this." Neighbors began to poke their heads out of their doors, phones in hand, already recording the scene unfolding on the lawn. Some of them had known Chelsea and Ethan for years, but Pat knew better than anyone that appearances could be deceiving. She could almost hear the murmurs beginning, questions of who was right and who was wrong, who had the true story. Chelsea's temper boiled over. "She fell, okay?" she screamed to the onlookers. trying to gather some semblance of control over the situation. My mother-in-law is just making things up. You can't believe any of this. She's crazy. The words felt like a slap in the face, each one designed to manipulate the narrative, to paint Pat as the villain. But the damage was already done. The neighbors had seen the police arrive, heard the shouting, witnessed Chelsea's tantrum. Pat could only imagine how the story was already shifting in their minds. Then, as quickly as it had started, Chelsea's rant slowed to a jagged, breathless stop. Pat watched as she crumpled into a heap on the porch, her shoulders shaking in anger. Ethan, for his part, stood there, arms crossed, still bristling with indignation, but even he seemed to be losing his ground. The protective orders had been served. The legal framework that Pat had fought so hard for was now in place. A buzz came through Pat's phone again. This time, it was a notification from social media. Chelsea had already posted about what had happened, calling it an attack on her family, claiming Pat had suddenly flipped and accused them falsely. She played the victim, painting a picture of a woman desperate for attention, too emotional to be believed. Pat shook her head as she read it. The lie was thin, brittle, but dangerous. The one thing she knew for sure was that Chelsea's words, like everything else she had tried to control, would backfire. Wayne had already responded to Chelsea's post, his screenshots captured with expert precision. "I've got it all documented," he had texted Pat earlier. "Every word she writes will be used against her." Pat let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, feeling the tension in her chest ease slightly. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot, but every step was one closer to the end. Back inside her home, she sat down in front of the fireplace, her fingers still gripping the phone. The warmth from the fire crackled in the background, a contrast to the cold tension outside. For a long time, Pat simply stared at the screen in silence. The fight was far from over, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't alone. She had made her stand. And now, no one could take that from her. The courtroom was cold, its sterile, unforgiving walls closing in on Patricia as she sat in the gallery, the low murmur of voices around her barely reaching her ears. She focused only on the sound of her own breath, steady and deep, as though she could control the rhythm of her heart. This was the next step in her fight, a fight that had already cost her so much. Ethan's lawyer, a tall man with sharp eyes and a firm handshake, sat at the table with a confident air, his dark suit crisp and neat. He was leaning over a pile of paperwork, flipping through it like it was just another case. Pat could see him whispering something to Ethan, who sat across the aisle, his face set in a permanent scowl. His gaze occasionally flicked to Pat, but his eyes were clouded with anger and resentment, refusing to acknowledge the guilt that was seeping through the cracks in his facade. The lawyer cleared his throat, standing up and addressing the judge. "Your Honor," he began smoothly, "my client's position is simple. Patricia Morgan is misremembering events. This whole incident is the result of a misunderstanding, a regrettable fall. There is no physical evidence to support her claim of an assault." Pat's breath caught in her throat. The audacity of his words, so dismissive, so calculating, stirred a knot in her stomach. But she refused to show any sign of weakness. She had been prepared for this moment. She knew exactly how Ethan would try to spin the story, how he would paint her as the confused, paranoid mother, unable to cope with the truth. She sat still, breathing deeply as her lawyer, Marla Jensen, stood up. The woman's demeanor was calm, almost stoic, but Pat could see the fierce determination in her eyes. Marla flipped open a folder, revealing a series of documents. She made eye contact with the judge, her voice firm as she addressed the court. "Your Honor, we have undeniable evidence, police reports, photographs of the injuries sustained by Mrs. Morgan, witness statements from the people who were present during the incident. Not only that, but we have medical records confirming the nature of her injuries. This is not a case of misremembering. This is a case of assault. The words hung in the air, settling heavily in the room. Pat could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, but this time, she didn't flinch. Marla continued, pulling up the photographs of Pat's bruises, the hair that had been forcibly pulled from her scalp, the medical documentation from the emergency room. Each piece of evidence was a blow to Ethan's defense, each one stripping away his narrative layer by layer. Ethan's lawyer scoffed, clearly flustered by the overwhelming proof. This is all circumstantial, a few bruises and some hair, hardly conclusive proof of an assault. But Marla was ready. Your Honor, we also have the statements of the people who witnessed this event firsthand. They confirm that Mrs. Morgan was attacked in a way that left her physically and emotionally shaken. The timeline, the details, they all add up. Pat watched as the lawyer's confidence began to crack. He tried to argue, tried to twist the narrative once more, but it was clear. Ethan's case was crumbling before him. He had nothing left to cling to. The judge, an older man with glasses perched on the edge of his nose, leaned forward, looking over the papers before him. I believe we have enough here to proceed, he said. His voice was calm, deliberate. This case will be continued. The evidence is compelling. Pat's heart raced. The weight of the moment settling in. She had been heard. Her voice, her truth, was finally taking root. As the court session recessed for the day, Pat stood up, her legs feeling strangely unsteady. She made her way out of the courtroom where Marla met her with a small smile. You did great today, Marla said softly. This is one battle down. There's more to come, but we're winning. Pat nodded, her mind racing. There was so much left to do, so many decisions to make. But for the first time in a long while, she felt something that had been missing for years: hope. Later that evening, as Pat sat in her living room, the fire crackling softly in the hearth, she made the decision. It was time to sever all ties to Ethan. She reached for the phone and called her attorney's office to arrange for the immediate change of her medical proxy and power of attorney. Ethan was no longer to have any control over her, not in any way. As she hung up, her gaze drifted to the box sitting in the corner of the room, the box of Ethan's childhood keepsakes. It had sat there for years, untouched, a remnant of a life she had once cherished. But now she knew. It was time for that to go too. She picked up the box, feeling the weight of the past in her hands. It was hard, harder than she expected. But she carried it outside, where the early evening chill nipped at her skin. With a quiet resolve, she placed it by the curb, ready for the charity pickup that would come the next day. Pat stepped back into her home, the door clicking shut behind her. She stood in the quiet for a moment, taking in the warmth of the fire and the stillness around her. She thought about Aiden, the only part of her past that hadn't been tarnished by the chaos of her son and his wife. Then, as if by some instinct, Pat picked up her phone and opened the message from Aiden. A drawing had appeared, a bright, colorful image of her, standing tall, a shield in her hands, surrounded by a soft, glowing light. Pat smiled softly, tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. Her grandson had always been her light, and now, for the first time, she could see the reflection of that light in herself. The shield was a symbol of strength, of protection, of the battle she had fought and would continue to fight for the people she loved. Pat put the phone down, the fire warming her face. Tomorrow, the next step would begin. But tonight, she was at peace. She had won the first battle, and she wasn't going to lose, not ever again. Patricia sat in the living room, the faint hum of the house around her mixing with the crackle of the fire. It had been a few days since the court session, and though she had made progress, there was still a gnawing tension in her chest. The battle wasn't over. It had barely begun. She reached for her phone, scrolling absent-mindedly through her messages, when her security camera system buzzed on the screen. The sudden alert pulled her back to the present. She swiped to the live feed, her pulse immediately quickening as she saw a figure pacing across the porch. Ethan. Her stomach lurched and her fingers hovered over the phone. The movement was erratic. His pacing, the way his hands shot up in frustration before dropping to his sides again. Pat could see him through the camera, as clear as day, his shoulders tense, his back rigid with anger. He was trying to stay calm, but the energy around him was all wrong. Pat's breath caught in her throat. He shouldn't be here. He was not supposed to be anywhere near her property. With a steadying exhale, Pat stepped back from the phone, her mind racing. He was violating the protective orders. Again. The ones that had been handed to him just days ago. The ones that had already started the legal machinery turning. Ethan's defiance wasn't just a refusal to acknowledge the law, it was an escalation. And now, he was standing on her porch, testing the boundaries of everything she had fought for. She didn't hesitate. Without a moment's doubt, she grabbed the phone and dialed 911. Her heart was pounding in her ears, but her voice was steady as she spoke to the dispatcher. "I need help," she said, her tone clipped, controlled. "My son is on my property, violating a protective order. I need officers here immediately." The dispatcher's voice was calm, professional. "We've received your request, ma'am. Officers are en route. Please stay inside and do not engage with him." Pat's grip tightened around the phone as she watched the feed. Ethan had stopped pacing now, standing still on the porch, his face twisted in frustration. He hadn't seen the camera, but he had seen the house. He knew she was inside. That realization hit her like a shockwave, an uncomfortable sense of exposure that she couldn't shake. He was trying to intimidate her, trying to force a reaction. But Pat wasn't going to give him that. Through the camera, she could see him moving toward the door now. His fist lifted, and for a second Pat thought he might pound on it. But then his hand dropped, and he turned to pace again, back and forth across the porch, muttering to himself. She could almost hear the words, though she knew they weren't meant for anyone but himself. He was angry, desperate, but also deeply aware of his own unraveling. Pat kept her distance, watching, waiting. It was only a matter of time before the officers arrived. She didn't want to be the one to go outside first. She wouldn't give him that satisfaction. Minutes passed like hours. Then, the familiar blue and red lights flashed through the window. Relief surged through Pat, but she didn't let it show. She watched, every muscle in her body tense, as two squad cars pulled up to the curb. The officers got out quickly, moving with purpose toward the porch where Ethan stood. Pat didn't have to see more. She already knew the next part. As the officers approached, Ethan's posture stiffened. The fury he had kept under control broke free, his voice rising again. "What are you doing here?" He spat at the officers. "You can't just walk in and—" One of the officers cut him off, his tone firm but calm. "Step back, sir. You are in violation of a court order. You need to leave the property immediately." Ethan didn't move. He stood there, his face red with anger, his body trembling slightly with the force of his emotions. "This is my house," he yelled. "I don't have to leave. You can't—" But the officers were prepared for this. They moved in quickly, calmly, their voices steady and measured. "You are not allowed on this property, and if you refuse to comply, you will be arrested." Ethan's jaw clenched, but the fight was draining from him. He stood there for a few seconds, breathing heavily, the air around him thick with anger, but he didn't make another move. Finally, he dropped his head and muttered something incoherent before taking a few steps back. The second officer stepped forward, issuing a stern warning to Ethan. "You're being arrested for violating a protective order. Do not resist." And then, just like that, it was over. Ethan was cuffed, his arms yanked behind his back and escorted toward the police car. Pat exhaled sharply, the tightness in her chest beginning to loosen. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment where Ethan would face the consequences of his actions. But it wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. Through the window, Pat watched as Chelsea appeared in the doorway, her face a mask of fury. She was already shouting, her words cutting through the air, but the officers were unbothered. One of them turned to her with a warning. "Ma'am, please step back. This is an active arrest. You need to stay clear." Chelsea's face twisted in rage. "You can't arrest him. You don't know what she's done. This is all her fault. She's lying." But the officers stood firm. "Ma'am, we're not here to argue. If you continue, we will have to take further action." Chelsea screamed, her voice breaking, but she didn't try to approach the officers again. She stomped her foot, her face flushed with humiliation as the squad car drove away, Ethan's figure slumped in the back seat. Pat felt a strange mix of satisfaction and emptiness. The justice she had fought for, the truth she had clung to, had finally been recognized. But even as she stood in the quiet aftermath, her heart remained heavy. She reached for her phone and opened the camera feed again, watching the footage of the arrest. She wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the need to hold on to the moment, to see with her own eyes that it was real. But she needed to know that this time, it was finally over. And then, her phone buzzed again. A new message from Wayne. "It's done. It's in the books. He's going down, and you're finally free." Pat stared at the words for a long moment. She had won this battle, but now the real work began. She wouldn't stop until the life she had rebuilt was hers, and hers alone. But for tonight, she allowed herself to breathe. Tomorrow, she would take the next step. Patricia sat in her living room, the dim glow of the fireplace casting shadows along the walls. The silence of the house was heavy, comforting, but it felt fragile, like the calm before another storm. She was still processing the events of the day, the arrest of Ethan, the finality of it all. She should have felt relief, but instead, there was an unsettling stillness, a waiting for something else to happen. She hadn't even gotten a chance to sit down and breathe before she heard it. The pounding on the door. Bang, bang, bang. It was loud, sharp, and filled with the kind of desperation that made her stomach turn. She knew who it was before she even looked up. Chelsea. Pat froze, her heart racing. She stood slowly, moving toward the door but not opening it. She could hear Chelsea's voice now, muffled but unmistakable. "Patricia!" Chelsea screamed. "Open the door! We need to talk!" Pat felt the rage and fear bubbling up inside her, but she refused to let it show. She didn't move. She didn't open the door. Instead, she walked slowly toward the window, peering out between the curtains. There, on the porch, stood Chelsea, her face twisted in anger, her hands clenched into fists. Pat watched as Chelsea knocked again, harder this time. She could see the red of Chelsea's face, the tightness in her posture. There was a desperate energy to her movements, as though she thought that somehow she could force her way back into Pat's life, back into the control she had lost. "Patricia!" Chelsea shouted again, her voice cracking with frustration. "Open the door. You can't just do this to me. You can't keep me from Aiden. This isn't over." Pat stood still, watching silently. She wasn't going to engage. She wouldn't be dragged into Chelsea's chaos again. The door would remain closed. But then Chelsea's voice rose even louder, cutting through the quiet of the house like a blade. "You can't keep him from me, you know. I'll take Aiden from you. I'll make sure you never see him again." Pat's chest tightened at the threat. The words felt like a weight on her shoulders. Aiden was her anchor, her reason for everything. Chelsea didn't understand that. She didn't care. To her, Aiden was a pawn, a bargaining chip. and the thought of him being caught in the middle of all this was enough to make Pat's stomach churn. But Pat didn't flinch. She didn't move toward the door. Instead, she picked up her phone, her fingers moving with precision as she dialed Wayne. The phone rang only once before he answered. "What's happening?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with concern. "I'm not opening the door," Pat said quietly, her eyes never leaving the window. "Chelsea's here. She's threatening to take Aiden away from me." Wayne's voice was steady, but she could hear the edge of something like fury, beneath his calm. "I'm coming over," he said. "Stay inside, don't engage." Pat nodded, though she knew Wayne couldn't see it. She hadn't planned to do anything else. Chelsea would have to go. There was no place for her in Pat's life anymore. She stood by the window, watching Chelsea's increasingly frantic motions. Pat's heart twisted as she saw her pacing back and forth on the porch, her anger palpable in every step. She had been so consumed with herself, with controlling every piece of the puzzle, that she didn't understand the damage she had caused. A soft knock at the door startled Pat, but it wasn't Chelsea this time. It was Wayne. He had arrived. Pat opened the door just wide enough to see him standing there, his expression hard and resolute. She stepped aside as he came in, his presence a quiet reassurance. "Stay inside," he said softly. "Let me handle this." Without another word, Wayne stepped outside, his strong frame blocking Chelsea's frantic gestures as he stood between her and the door. Pat watched through the crack in the door, her pulse quickening. "Leave. Now," Wayne said, his voice low but firm. There was no argument, no hesitation in his tone. It was final. Chelsea's eyes narrowed as she glared at Wayne, her lips trembling with fury. "You can't do this," she screamed. "You think you can just shut me out? I'll take him from you, Pat. I'll make sure you never see Aiden again. You'll be sorry." Wayne didn't flinch. He didn't rise to the bait. "You need to go. Right now." Chelsea stood there for a long moment, her breath coming in sharp gasps, her chest heaving with the force of her anger. And then, slowly, like a storm losing its power, her shoulders slumped, and she turned, her face flushed with humiliation. With a final bitter glance, she stormed off the porch, her footsteps harsh and unsteady. Pat watched her retreat down the walkway, her heart still pounding in her chest. She didn't say anything. There was nothing left to say. Wayne turned back to Pat, his face softening as he stepped inside. "It's over," he said simply, closing the door behind him. Pat didn't reply. Instead, she reached for her phone again, her hands steady as she typed out a quick message to Marla. "Chelsea's here. She's threatening to take Aiden. What do I do?" It only took a moment for Marla's response to arrive. "Update your filings. Add additional restrictions. We'll ensure they can't come near Aiden again." Pat nodded to herself. The fight wasn't over, but she was one step closer. She would make sure Aiden was protected, no matter what. Wayne stepped into the living room, his eyes thoughtful but not surprised. "You're stronger than you think," he said. Pat smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. "I didn't have a choice." A sudden noise from the hallway made her look up. Aiden stood at the entrance, his small face uncertain. He had been watching, listening to it all from the other side of the door. Pat's heart twisted in her chest. She stepped toward him, kneeling to his level, pulling him into her arms. "I'm here, sweetheart," she whispered, holding him tightly. "And I always will be." For the first time in days, Pat felt the weight of everything she had fought for begin to settle in. She wasn't just protecting herself anymore. She was protecting the one thing that mattered most: her family. And she would do whatever it took to keep them safe. But the storm wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. The certified packet arrived on a cold December morning, wrapped in thick, official envelopes. Patricia held it in her hands, the weight of the legal documents heavier than she anticipated. The seal on the envelope felt cold to the touch, and for a moment, it almost seemed unreal, until she carefully sliced through the paper and pulled out the court date for the full protective orders. The date was set. The date she'd been waiting for, dreading, but also preparing for. She sat down at her kitchen table, her fingers running over the text, and a quiet storm brewed within her chest. It was happening. The final step in her fight for her safety, for her future, and for Aiden's future. It was time to face her son in a way she had never imagined. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She looked up as Wayne entered, his presence a quiet anchor in the storm of her mind. He'd been with her every step of the way, and he wasn't about to let her face this alone. "I got the court date," Pat said, her voice barely above a whisper. Wayne nodded, his expression serious but not unkind. He knew what this meant. "This is it, Pat. It's going to be hard, but you've got this. You're stronger than you think." Pat forced a smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. The fear was still there, lurking just beneath the surface. She had been strong for so long, but this was a new kind of strength. The kind that made her face Ethan head-on, knowing that everything they had once shared, family, trust, the simple hope for a better future, was forever gone. Wayne moved to the other side of the table, opening a large binder filled with papers and photographs. He had organized the evidence meticulously, each page labeled and categorized. The police reports, the photos of her bruises, the ER records, all laid out in perfect order. He was ready. They were ready. But Pat couldn't shake the cold pit in her stomach. Marla's voice broke through her thoughts as she called on speakerphone. "Pat, I've been reviewing your testimony for tomorrow. We're going to make sure everything is clear, concise, and compelling. The facts speak for themselves. Ethan doesn't stand a chance. But we need you to stay calm, focused. This is your chance to tell your side of the story, the truth. No more hiding, no more silence." Pat closed her eyes, letting Marla's words sink in. No more silence. It was true. This was her moment to speak, to make her voice heard. She could feel the weight of it, the responsibility of it. But she had to do it. For Aiden. For herself. As she hung up, the silence of the room felt heavy. A soft beep from her phone pulled her attention away. It was a voicemail. Aiden's voice. "Grams, it's Aiden. I just wanted to say, I'm proud of you. You're doing the right thing. I know this is hard. I love you." Pat's heart clenched. She hit replay, listening again. The words were simple, but they were everything. He was proud of her. That was enough. She listened a third time, the room quiet as snowflakes began to drift past the window, their delicate forms settling into the early evening air. Outside, the world was still, beautifully calm and cleansing, as though the earth itself was holding its breath. Pat sat back, the weight of Aiden's message settling into her heart, grounding her. The snow continued to fall softly outside, its quiet rhythm mirroring the peace she had found within herself. The fight wasn't over. The battle tomorrow would be the hardest one yet. But for the first time in a long while, Pat didn't feel the crippling fear. She felt something else instead. Hope, clarity, and the unshakable resolve that she would no longer let her past define her future. She stood up slowly, walking to the window, her hand resting on the cold glass. The snow continued to fall outside, covering everything in a blanket of white. The world seemed to pause in the stillness, waiting for what would come next. Pat didn't have the answers, but she knew one thing for sure. No matter what happened tomorrow, she was ready. She had already made her stand, and nothing would take that away from her. The courtroom was a quiet battlefield, its stark white walls closing in as Patricia stepped into the witness stand. She had rehearsed this moment over and over in her mind, yet standing there, in front of the judge and her son, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the room pressing down on her. She swallowed, steadying her breath. This was her moment. This was where everything she had fought for would be decided. Ethan sat across from her, his face drawn tight with anxiety, his eyes darting to the papers in front of him, as if reading them over and over would change the outcome. Chelsea sat beside him, her body stiff with an energy Pat could feel across the room. The two of them, once family, now looked like strangers, desperate and unprepared. It was impossible to ignore how much they both seemed like they had nothing left to stand on. The tension in the room was palpable, but Pat's gaze remained fixed on the judge. She would not let them see her hesitation. Not now. The judge, a man in his mid-50s, his glasses perched low on his nose, leaned forward slightly, his voice cutting through the still air. "Mrs. Morgan, you may proceed with your testimony." Pat's pulse quickened, but she stood tall. She had worked too hard to be intimidated. "I will tell you exactly what happened," she said, her voice clear and unwavering, "because the truth is not something I can hide any longer." She spoke slowly, methodically, recounting the events of that fateful evening. Every detail, every moment, laid bare. She didn't dwell on the pain or the fear. She simply told the facts. Ethan had struck her. Chelsea had grabbed her hair and yanked her backward. The moment stretched into eternity, but Pat's voice never wavered. She didn't need to make excuses or apologize. She was telling the truth. The silence that followed her testimony felt heavy, but she didn't break eye contact with the judge. The truth was out there now, and Pat knew it was enough. The prosecutor called up the police officers next, the two officers who had arrived that night, who had separated the family, who had photographed Pat's injuries, and who had processed the scene. Their statements were direct, confirming Pat's version of events without hesitation. They testified about the bruises, the hair loss, the clear signs of physical assault that had been documented in the police reports. Pat's heart settled a little with each confirming word, each statement reinforcing what she had already said. This was no longer just her word against theirs. This was the law. This was justice. Next came the witnesses, guests who had been at the dinner, who had seen the entire ordeal unfold. One by one, they stepped forward, offering their testimony. Some had frozen, unable to act in the moment, but all of them confirmed that Ethan had struck Pat, and Chelsea had physically assaulted her. They each recounted what they had seen, not in the dramatic terms that Chelsea had attempted to spin, but in quiet, factual statements. Chelsea's eyes flicked nervously from one witness to another. Her face was pale, her mouth set in a thin line. She knew the tide was turning. She knew there was no getting out of this. Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his lips tight, his gaze never meeting Pat's. He had fought so hard to maintain control over everything, his family, his home, his life. But now it was slipping away. He had underestimated Pat, and now it was too late. Pat didn't allow herself to feel satisfaction. Not yet. The judge had the final say. And when the time came, she would let the weight of the evidence speak for itself. The judge sat back in his chair, the room falling into an uneasy quiet as he reviewed the paperwork. His glasses glinted in the overhead light as he adjusted them, his eyes scanning the documents in front of him. "I believe," the judge said, his voice firm and steady. "The evidence here is clear. Mrs. Morgan's testimony is supported by the police reports, the medical records, and the testimony of the witnesses." He paused, looking up at both Ethan and Chelsea, his eyes piercing. "The court finds that the protective orders will be made permanent. Mr. Morgan, Mrs. Morgan, You are hereby prohibited from contacting Mrs. Morgan, and the restraining orders will be filed immediately. Pat exhaled, the weight of it sinking into her bones. The fight had been long, and it had drained her. But now, she had won, and nothing could take that away. Marla, who had been sitting quietly in the back, gave a brief nod of approval as the judge's ruling echoed through the room. There was no more legal battle. There was no more negotiating. This was done. The judge's voice broke through her thoughts. In addition, he continued, we will also review Mrs. Morgan's estate filings. We'll ensure that her assets are protected, and the changes to her will, as per her request, will be finalized. Pat felt a lump form in her throat. She had made those decisions months ago, but hearing them finalized, hearing them confirmed, made it all feel so permanent. Ethan no longer had a claim to anything, not her property, not her life, not her future. As the proceedings came to a close, Pat turned to Marla, who was already pulling out a new set of papers from her briefcase. The paperwork for the trust had already been set in motion. The change to her will had been made months ago, but now it was real. Pat had taken control. With one final, unspoken promise to herself, she walked out of the courtroom with Marla, her shoulders a little straighter than they had been when she walked in. She was done. Ethan and Chelsea could try to spin their stories all they wanted, but it didn't matter. It was over. Pat walked out of the courthouse with a sense of finality. A new chapter had begun, and in this chapter, she was in control. She had won. Patricia sat at the kitchen table, the morning sun streaming through the windows and casting long shadows across the floor. The world outside was calm, the hustle of the streets muted by the soft blanket of winter snow. It was a new year, a fresh start, and for the first time in a long while, Pat felt the weight of her past lifting. She took a deep breath, exhaling slowly, and ran her fingers across the smooth surface of her life binder. A project she had started years ago, but never had the courage to fully complete. Now, after everything, it was the final piece of her reclaiming what she had lost. The binder, filled with letters to her loved ones, instructions for her future, and memories from a time before her life had unraveled, now felt like the anchor she needed. She had spent hours the past few weeks adding to it, detailing her wishes, securing Aiden's future, and marking the moments of her life that truly mattered. The tasks that had seemed overwhelming before, the ones she'd buried under years of denial, were now manageable. Simple, even. Pat had become the keeper of her own story. She smiled softly as she added the final note to her binder. For Aiden, when he's ready. The words felt like a promise to never let him carry the weight of her struggles, a promise to protect him, just as she had fought for her own life. It was more than a binder. It was a map to the future she had fought for. It was her life, reclaimed. The front door opened with a soft creak, and Pat turned to see Wayne standing in the doorway, his presence as steady and reassuring as always. He had been with her every step of the way, and now, as she reached the end of this chapter, he was still here. "You're up early," he said with a knowing smile, taking in the scene, the quiet, the light, the completed binder. He stepped inside, carrying a small, carefully wrapped box in his hands. Pat looked up from the table, her heart swelling with a quiet kind of joy. "I'm starting to think I can breathe again," she said softly, her eyes meeting his. Wayne placed the box down gently on the table. "I'm glad to hear that," he said, his voice warm but with an edge of something deeper. He reached for the box and unwrapped it slowly, revealing a small silver pocket watch. It was simple, elegant, with delicate engravings along the sides. Pat blinked, her breath catching in her chest. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her fingers grazing the cool surface of the watch. Wayne smiled, a small but knowing smile. It's for the time you've regained, for everything you've won, for everything you can now do for yourself. Pat turned the watch over in her hands, her eyes tracing the intricate design. Time, she thought. The concept had always been so elusive to her. For years, she had let it slip away, letting the fear of losing her family, of losing control, consume her. But now, for the first time in so long, she was taking time back for herself. I think it's perfect, she said quietly, her eyes meeting Wayne's. For a new beginning. Wayne nodded, his expression softening as he leaned against the table. You look stronger than ever, he said, his voice low and full of admiration. Pat smiled, a small laugh escaping her lips. It felt like a weight had been lifted, not just physically, but emotionally. I think I'm finally starting to feel that way, she admitted, the words feeling like a revelation. The room was quiet for a moment as they both took in the peacefulness of the morning, the stillness that had come after the storm. Outside, the world seemed to hold its breath as the snow continued to fall softly, blanketing everything in its quiet calm. Pat stood up, her fingers lightly tracing the pocket watch once more, and then placed it in her bag. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a symbolic step forward, a reminder of the time she had reclaimed. She stepped toward the window, the snow now a full-blown flurry outside, and paused for a moment, her eyes tracing the path of a single snowflake drifting slowly to the ground. Everything outside felt different now. The world seemed softer, quieter, as though it too was waiting for something new. She turned to Wayne. I'm going to start teaching the craft class at the community center next week, she said, her voice lighter than it had been in years. And I've been thinking about picking up the piano again. Wayne's eyebrows raised slightly. The piano? Pat chuckled. Yes, it's been years, but I think it's time. Wayne's smile widened. I think that sounds perfect. Pat laughed softly, the sound rich with relief. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living. She was finally living for herself. The snow fell outside, the world quiet and still, and Pat knew, with absolute certainty, that this was the beginning of the rest of her life. She had reclaimed it, and now it was hers to shape. The soft hum of the auditorium, the rustle of programs, and the buzz of excited voices filled the air as Patricia entered, her steps slow but steady. She could feel the familiar weight of the evening, but this time it didn't feel as heavy. Her chest didn't tighten with anxiety. The looming specter of Ethan and Chelsea no longer haunted her thoughts. She had moved beyond that. Tonight it was about Aiden, his school concert, his moment. Her eyes scanned the room, the soft glow of the stage lights catching on faces, all turned toward the performance. There, in the back, Ethan and Chelsea stood apart, like shadows, isolated by the court orders that had been their undoing. Ethan's gaze flicked briefly to her, but there was nothing in his eyes. No recognition, no hint of the son she had known. Just a hollow stare, as if he had lost everything but couldn't yet admit it to himself. Pat's heart fluttered as she spotted Aiden, standing near the front of the group, looking for her in the sea of faces. When he saw her, his face lit up like the sun breaking through clouds. He broke from the group, rushing down the aisle with the energy of a child who had been holding in his excitement all evening. Pat's breath caught in her throat as he reached her, his small arms wrapping around her waist. She held him close, the familiar scent of his hair, the warmth of his small body, grounding her in a way nothing else could. I'm so proud of you, sweetheart, she whispered into his hair, her voice thick with emotion. I'm proud of you too, Grams, Aiden replied, his voice muffled against her. I'm glad you came. Pat pulled back slightly, her fingers gently brushing the hair from his forehead. She smiled, her heart swelling. Always, Aiden. Always. For a moment, everything else, the tension, the years of fear and uncertainty, melted away. It was just her and Aiden, and she would fight for him. Always. A few minutes later, after the concert had ended and the applause had faded, Pat sat in the quiet of the backstage area, signing the final documents of her life, the last pieces of her new will. It had been drafted months ago, but today, with a finality she hadn't anticipated, she signed the scholarship papers, ensuring that Aiden would receive the future she had fought to give him. The papers slipped easily into their folders, and Pat placed the pen down with a steady hand. She was done. She had made sure Aiden was protected from the chaos of the past, from the people who had once called themselves family, but who now meant nothing. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at the screen. A message from Wayne. "You did it. Aiden's future is secure. This is your victory." She smiled softly, feeling the warmth of his words wrap around her like a protective shield. But then, from across the room, her eyes caught Ethan's again. He stood by the exit, his arms crossed, the weight of everything that had been lost pulling him down. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes, those eyes, were the eyes of a man who had come to the painful realization that the world he once thought he controlled had slipped from his grasp. The family he had tried to dominate had broken free. Pat's gaze didn't waver. She didn't flinch. The years of hurt, the years of manipulation no longer held sway over her. She had fought for her voice, for her dignity, and for Aiden's safety. Ethan had lost the privilege of her attention long ago. He had chosen his path. And now he would have to live with the consequences. She stood slowly, her spine straight, her heart light. With one last purposeful glance at Ethan and Chelsea, separated, diminished, and powerless, Pat walked out of the auditorium. The door closed behind her with a soft click, the sound reverberating in the quiet night. The snow had begun to fall again, a gentle dusting over the world outside, soft and cleansing. The street was peaceful, empty. For the first time, Pat felt the weight of her decisions settle into place, a quiet confidence filling the spaces where fear had once lived. She didn't look back. They punched, they pulled, she thought, her breath visible in the crisp winter air. But 911 handled the moment, I handled the rest. And for the first time in a long time, she walked forward without looking back. The future stretched wide and full of possibilities.